My name is Shannon Gilmore. I'm the Executive Director of Lincoln County Historical Association. I know many of you are familiar with our organization, but in case you're not, we're the organization that stewards the 1754 Chapman Hall House in Damariscotta, the 1761 Pownell Courthouse in Dresden, and the 1811 Old Jail in Wiscasset. We also offer year-round programming, just like the one you're participating in this evening, and educational programming for students around the county throughout the year through our education department. We actually love working with educators to offer programs that fit within classroom needs. So please reach out to us if you're interested in working with us. We'd love to hear from you. Speaking of reaching out, we would also love to talk with you about becoming a member, a volunteer, or other supporter of LCHA. We are a small but mighty group and always welcoming to new friends. Welcome to tonight's talk. This is so exciting. I'm excited that it's raining and the rain drove us inside for the very first online lecture of the fall. First off, I want you to know that this lecture is being recorded and will be available for online viewing probably early next week. I need a couple days to get it up and running, and I will automatically email you when it's ready. So if you get logged off tonight or something like that, then don't worry, you can catch up later. Our speaker tonight, Rob, is having trouble with his camera, so you won't see his face, but his presentation is good to go. We can hear him clearly, so we should be fine. We will make time for questions at the end of his presentation. So as questions come to you throughout the presentation, please go ahead and send them to me in the chat. I'll gladly read them to him during Q&A time, as long as we have enough time to cover them. Just letting a few more people into the waiting room. So I'd love to introduce Rob Stevens. He lives in Woolwich. He has a boatyard in Phippsburg and has been building wooden boats for 45 years. And he was instrumental in the building of Maine's first ship in Bath, Virginia. 8 years ago, he built a bateau and with 5 others followed in the steps of the Arnold expedition through Maine and Quebec. The last few years, to commemorate the 250th anniversary of Arnold's original trip, he has been working with the Arnold Expedition Society to build several replicas, and has been working with students and other volunteers around the state to do that. I'm so thrilled to have him. He may remember I first reached out to him literally months ago about doing a talk this September, and he's been wonderful to work with and open to doing this presentation for us. It is going to be really great. And I urge you all to join me in welcoming Rob. And Rob, I will pass it off to you. I know that if we were all together, we'd hear a round of applause. And in fact, I see some people clapping on their screens.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. What I'm going to talk about is the historical Arnold expedition, the the recreating it in 2017, and how we're preparing to celebrate it now. Um, this, I think, this is probably an unusual thing to start with, but I am going to give a list of things that if I fail to talk about, I wish you would ask me
Ooh, I'll
because,
make notes.
okay. And one of them is that the route was not known. One of them is the quality of the boats. Uh, One of them is the skills of the bateau men. Um, the handling cargo, which is sort of in the skills part. And the last is about women and Native Americans and African Americans on the trip. So if I fail to mention those, please ask me about them. The Arnold Expedition Historical Society, we're based in Pittston. The state, meaning you people, own the house and the site of where the bateaus were built 250 years ago. It's up in Pittston, and the house is a 1765 house of Reuben Colburn. Um, I want to give credit to Harding Carter. He is always coming up with different ways to kill me. And that would have been the 2017 trip. And I want to give credit to the book Arundel by Kenneth Roberts. And a lot of people in Maine, this is how they know about Arnold, is through the book Arundel. And thanks to Kenneth Roberts and Arundel, I have all these ideas about the journey that I have to correct because I disagree with Mr. Roberts. All right. Let's see if this. There we go. Benedict Arnold was from Connecticut, Norwich, lived in New Haven. He, excuse me. He was active in protesting about the way the British government treated American colonials. A huge part of it, shouldn't surprise you, is that protesting about taxes and how businesses were regulated. He was a sea captain, he was a merchant. He helped create the militia in New Haven. He One of the things that affected his personality is he had come from a very upper crust family. His great great grandfather had been the first governor of Rhode Island, and as they went down every generation and divided equally what was being passed on to the next generation, by the time it got to his father, there wasn't that much left. And then the big tragedy is that his father, when he lost three children over the time period, developed a severe drinking problem. And so one of the things about Arnold is he was big about protecting the family name. Um, he, as soon as people in New Haven heard of Lexington and Concord, he and his militia headed up to Boston to join the siege of Boston. On the trip to Boston, he met somebody coming from Boston who was coming to inform the people in Connecticut what was happening. And somehow the two of them seemed to know that they were cannon Ticonderoga, which was basically just a backwater fort from the French and Indian War. And, he knew that there were cannon there. And so he headed off to Boston and got the Massachusetts Provincial Congress to send him to Ticonderoga to retrieve the cannon. At the same time, the other man who was heading to Connecticut got a few people in Connecticut to also go after the cannon. The Connecticut group were related to the Green Mountain Boys from Vermont, and they were all prepared to take the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga. Arnold heard about this and raced there to where all these Green Mountain Boys were, and just walks in and says, "I'm in charge here." Arnold had uh, Arnold had some good points and some bad points. One of his bad points is he had the ability to irritate the people who are in the same level as him. In other words, he came in and says, "I'm in charge." And the Green Mountain Boys, who were Ethan Allen, were like, "What do you mean you're in charge? Forget it. Get out of here." Well, they did manage to, Arnold with the Green Mountain Boys took Fort Ticonderoga. It was not that big a deal. It was basically about 40 old privates there. After taking Ticonderoga, Arnold realized that they should go to the outlet of Lake Champlain, which is going north, and take the fort there to make sure that the British wouldn't control Lake Champlain. He did that, and in doing, he found out that there were only something like 900 soldiers in all of Canada at this point in time. He wrote up a set of plans as to how to take Canada. I mean, literally a materials list. How many tents, how many guns, how much ammunition, how many soldiers. He wrote up a set of plans, sent them to the Continental Congress. And one of the things I feel is important, he also said, you should find somebody besides me to be in charge. Find somebody with more experience to be in charge. Anyways, his I won't really get into it. He manages to irritate all the officers of the same level, and he is not put in charge of Lake Champlain, and he resigns, which is a typical thing in the American Revolution. The officer corps was constantly going and saying, "Oh, you put this one in over me. I should have gotten that promotion. I quit." That was a very common thing among the officers. In this slide here, you'll see um, the British and the French and the Indians for over 100 years had been fighting, and their major way of doing this was to go up and down Lake Champlain, connecting with the Hudson, to either come down and attack the English or to go up and attack the Canadians. This had been going on through 5 wars, I believe it is. This was the route everybody was familiar with. There was another route that people were somewhat familiar with. That was to go up the Hudson and head west on the Mohawk River, which would put you in Lake Ontario. There were a few other routes that would not be a good way to attack Canada. One would be to sail to the St. Lawrence, but that meant you would be going by the British naval base in Halifax. Another route was to go up the Connecticut River, but then that involved a lot of portaging through the woods. Another route would be to go the St. John River and into the St. Lawrence up in New Brunswick. And the last route was the Kennebec River. And some people make it sound as if uh, nobody knew about this route. They make it sound like this British officer who did it in 1761 was the only white man to have done this route. Well, that wasn't quite true. The British officer did it in 1761. Here's a map from 1754 that includes the whole route. And for 100 years, they'd been talking about sending armies up and down this way. As a matter of fact, right after Lexington and Concord, the citizens of Portland, which was then called Falmouth, sent some people up this route to see what was going on, to see if the British and the Indians were planning on attacking. Um, uh, I should look at my notes. That would be a good idea. Um, they the in 1754, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had sent 500 soldiers and 13 bateaux up this route as far as almost to what is now Flagstaff Lake. I'm going to keep going here. Like I was saying, this is the Colburn House. Believe it's 1886. Is this There's this picture. We still own the house. It is in need of love. It hasn't been open in about 8 or 10 years, and it's supposedly going to right now get a new foundation and to be fumigated for powder post beetles. We also, the state and us citizens, we own 2 barns that are newer than 1775, but in them we have a display on bateau building. Um, Let me continue. And in 2017, Harding Carter, the second from the left, came up with this idea of let's come up with a new way to kill Rob. and he was saying, let's do the Arundel trip. Let's go up the Kennebec. And we built this boat. Um, it's a boat that was a design picked in 1975 to recreate to celebrate the Arnold expedition. And I will get back to that. This is the boat, and you will see how little freeboard, how close the edge of the top of the boat is to the water. You'll also see that it leaks, which is great because that makes it historically accurate. We would definitely want to be historically accurate. And this is the design that we have come up with this year after doing a bunch of research. The 1975 design, before the internet, there was so much harder to find information, and they basically modified a logging bateau. And it turned out that by removing the middle out of the logging bateau, it made some problems with it. The soldiers, Arnold and Washington, were smart enough to say the people to go on this trip should be bateau men and people used to being in the forest. They did not find that. It was all volunteers, and quite a large number of them were farmers. A lot of the officers were merchants, blacksmiths, what have you, some brickmakers, a few sailors, but basically no bateau men. And I will get back to that. Um, and so they started they went to the route, they sailed, they marched from Boston to Newburyport, trying to keep it a secret. At Newburyport, they got on 11 ships, sailed to Augusta. Some of the ships could not make it past Pittston, which is where the bateaus were. And they spent a couple of days transferring cargo from the ships to the bateaus and getting the bateaus up to Augusta, Fort Western. Augusta is where the salt water ends, and you now have to go up rapids. This is Fort Western in Augusta, and it looks much better than it did by the time of the American Revolution. It had been built for the French and Indian War and was in rather sad shape by then. Um, and, and their next stop, going 20 miles up the Kennebec, would be to Fort Halifax in Winslow, across from what is now Waterville. And also, it looked pretty sad. It was, there was no reason to maintain it after the British took Canada from the French in 1761, around that time period. By the time they got to Fort Halifax, about 20 miles from Fort Augusta, they began to realize how hard it was to move the bateaus up the river. Uh, and here is an extremely idealized picture of moving the bateaus. There would be about 6 or 7 men assigned to each one of these 220 bateaus. The bateaus were not for carrying the men. The bateaus were for carrying the cargo. I refer to the bateaus are basically like, those World War II movies where you see those, I believe they're called deuce and a half. The truck next size up from a pickup truck. Carrying the cargo was what these boats were meant to do. Getting the soldiers to Quebec, most of them would march up along shore. Uh, Polling was probably should have been the major way of moving the boat. You see in this photo, in this drawing, people rowing, people paddling, people poling. Poling, and there would only have been two people in the boat poling. Poling is quite a skill. It is quite a skill to move 2,000 pounds of boat and cargo up rapids. And this was where the big problem came. And they did not learn this in one day. You know, by the time they'd done 20 miles to Fort Halifax, they still were not skilled at this. And a huge amount of the time, they had to be in the water and drag it along. I don't know if you can make out, but in the right of this picture, there are two guys pulling on bushes. Um, this is what they actually ended up doing later on when a hurricane came through and created a flood. Um, the Maine Maritime Museum refers to these creatures as idling power units. Actually, it says in my slide that to carry the boats, no, they were to carry the cargo, over 100 tons of supplies had to be moved wherever they had to go around a set of waterfalls. And these are actually antique cows. There's only 600 of these American milking Devons, and my friend Jeremy in Arousik has three of them. And these are the type of things they would have to get around. And in Skowhegan, there actually was quite a rough.
Yeah.
Um, there,
It's raining like a, well, you know that. Yeah, okay.
it was raining then too.
Sorry, Rob, we had someone accidentally wasn't muted, but I've got it.
That's, that's, um, uh, by the time they'd gotten to Skowhegan, they'd already done a number of rapids, which they didn't feel they could do. But Skowhegan had a fascinating thing. It was basically almost a cliff on an island in the middle of the falls. This is a drawing done in 1903 of the soldiers going up that very steep uh, um, uh, portage, carry, and we call it a carry here, around the Skowhegan Falls. Um, in our 2017 trip, we got the kids to carry the bateau. When we got to Skowhegan, much to our surprise, there was a high school river rescue class, and they all went and helped carry the bateau up the carry in the portage there. There was one other thing that we had in 2017 that was not available in 1775, and that is there are quite a number of dams which would raise a big flat water area above it. But the one thing that you have at dams that you did not have at the rapids, you know, but the one thing you have at dams in 2017 is we were all set to haul this up at Waterville past the first dam and carry all our supplies. And we had, you know, block and tackles and what have you, and we worked on it. But one thing you find at dams is drunken fishermen. And the drunken fishermen were more than happy to help us carry these bateaus around the falls. Um, Continuing on past Skowhegan and more rapids, you get to this 13-mile carry from the Kennebec River to what is now Flagstaff Lake. Actually, you're just getting back into the Kennebec River. The Kennebec River goes north of this area and in 180 degrees comes back into what was then called the Dead River. It's since been flooded and now is Flagstaff Lake. But it was too rough to carry birch bark canoes or bateaus. And so this is a thousands-year-old uh, carry route of the Native Americans, and there were three ponds along the route to get to the Kennebec. Um, it wasn't necessarily a warpath. The British officer who went this route in 1761 wrote about how the Wabanaki were very careful to keep their carries hidden. And that is because, other groups, the Mohawk would come and attack the Wabanaki. And so these routes through the woods were not easy to find. Um, and the reason why this is relevant for me is that designing a bateau, the bateau would have to go down a carry that is hidden. In other words, this would be something that you could take a 16-foot canoe down and not leave a trace of where it is. And here we are trying to make a bateau that will go in something along those lines. And so we made rather small bateaus, which when Arnold saw them, he requested 20 more of them, making a total of 220. In 2017, we rolled our bateau. We sat there and moved logs along these dirt roads, the 13 miles. And one of the things, again, that we had that they didn't have is old people. For some reason, old people kept wandering out of the woods to help us. The youngest one of these in this photo is 68 years old. The oldest one, I'm ashamed, I wish I had the picture, is an 82-year-old woman, not very big, and there's a picture of her holding two of these log rollers as she moves them forward. We took 5 days to do this 13 miles. They took 5 days to do the 13 miles, and they had to go back and forth, not only carrying their boats, but all their cargo. We cheated again. We cheated and had a pickup truck move our cargo. And unfortunately for the idling power units, by now, the last of them became protein. By the time they had gotten to this point, which is only 20 some days into the trip, they had already lost a huge amount of their food. They'd lost it by the bateaus being swamped. They'd lost it by the food getting wet. And they had 45 days worth of food supposedly, and by now some of them had just stopped waiting for the last group to come because they'd run out of food. Poor General Enos. The last group, which includes a company of people from the lower Kennebec, they voted to turn back. And Roger Enos was very strongly criticized for doing this. And they turned back without Benedict Arnold knowing about this, because Benedict Arnold was so far ahead, he was not aware. But you have to figure these three groups of about 275 soldiers had witnessed, 50, 60, 70 bateaus destroyed, lost, the food lost. They had witnessed all these soldiers sick, returning down the Kennebec. And they get to this point, they come up with the soldiers who have no food. There's no reason to think the last group was any better at getting the food there. In fact, they probably had worse luck. because they were taking bigger bateaus and heavier loads, but with the same skill level. But they returned, and even though one of the three groups was from the lower Kennebec, they did not quit the revolution. And they didn't, the ones from here did not just go home. They went back to the siege of Boston. They had been at the siege of Boston when this whole trip was organized. They went back to the siege of Boston, and many of them fought through the rest of the revolution. Many of the ones who at this point were privates ended up the revolution as officers. One of them, who was a substitute for a private, ended up as a lieutenant colonel. These were a lot of people who are very committed to the cause. And this is now going up the Dead River, and here we are dragging up through one of the rapids, one of the falls. At this point, the Arnold had had a flood, which actually made it, in a strange way, better for them, though nobody says that, because as you can see, there's no cargo in this boat. So there's really no reason to be even moving it along. And as you'll see in this one, it's even when there's not falls. I mean, here we are trying to move it through the water. All right, what's going on? Let me stop this. And going down the Chaudière, we now did a flood. And you can see the conditions as this is what they would be trying to go up against. We were trying to go down against this. I don't know how you could possibly have gone up against it. By now, we have probably swamped the boat more than 15 times. Just to tell you about how Harding Carter likes to try to kill me, I don't know how to swim. And that's me standing in the water with the line holding the bateau. No, how am I going to stop this? There we go. Let's try that again. And as was typical throughout the whole trip for the 1775 and 1975, is we had to repair the bateaus. We had gone and put about a 6-foot crack in one of the planks, and we were now repairing it again. And the discussion that's going on now is I'm asking who has 100% cotton underwear, because I want it for fitting it in the cracks of the boat. And this is right after leaving that repair. And this is what it was like. This is late October. And as you can see, the water is a little bit rough. You can see the water is up halfway up on the inside of the boat. And you can hear the guy steering the boat. It says we're going to go to shore and bail the water, which by that time we were full of water. Get rid of this one. Oh, I don't know why that worked. And this is a typical evening after all this, soaking wet and trying to get warm. Actually, with the exception of the chinos I'm wearing, I have nothing but wool on. And so I don't care that it's in the mid 30s. I'm as warm as possibly can be. In fact, I think I slept in a puddle that night. I can't believe I managed to get a campfire going. And let me stop that. And by now the Arnold soldiers had lost all their boats. They had lost most of their food. They had been eating their shoes. They had been eating anything they had leather. They'd been eating their candles and their soap. They unfortunately had to kill a couple of dogs that soldiers had brought with them. They were going, they had gone days without food. A number of them starved to death in this section of crossing the Canadian border into the downriver section, which was the Chaudière there. And they get to Quebec City mid-November, starving, naked, and no way to cross the river, and the British know they're coming. And they sit there and they stare at Quebec City for 6 weeks, trying to figure out how they're going to attack it. And like I say, the Arnold soldiers are hungry. They don't have proper clothing. They don't have shoes. Um, General Montgomery comes up from Lake Champlain, takes Montreal, comes down. The last thing they want to take is Quebec. And he shows up with some clothing, and he's now in charge because he's the general. But again, they stare at the walls of Quebec. I wish every one of you would raise your hand if you've seen Quebec. There I go. Some of them you have seen it. I can't imagine sitting outside that city with a musket thinking, okay, yeah, sure, I can take it. The other thing is everybody whose ancestors are Yankees, raise your hand. Oh, good. I see a lot of people raise their hand. It's our fault that we didn't take it. Not really, but one of the strange things in the revolution was that enlistments usually ended on the 31st of December. And the Yankees all up there were like, nope, I'm here for you to the 31st of December, but come January 1st, I'm going home. And but they were willing to attack this city on the 31st of December. I think I would have said, I think I have a hangnail. I can't make it today. But they attacked the city in a blinding snowstorm. They had two groups attack the western wall just as a way to try to draw the British soldiers away. On the left of this map, you'll see General Montgomery, and he attacked along a route that only two soldiers side by side could go down this route. And they run into a barricade. The British soldiers flee, but one of them touches off a loaded cannon, and it kills the first 10 Americans in line, which means it's killed General Montgomery, it's killed the next officer and the next officer. And, the soldiers behind who are marching along, in almost in single file, they don't know what's happened, and their surviving officer retreats, and that's the end of them. On the top of this, you'll see that Arnold came along, again, the lower town below the walls. Arnold comes along, and they're in the lower town. And part of the bad luck on this thing is right at the very beginning, Arnold gets shot in the leg badly. And Arnold, for all what his good parts and his bad parts, his good parts is his men loved him. And he was very good at getting his men motivated. And so Arnold is protesting, taking off the field, and Captain Morgan takes over. And they charge and they take the first barricade and take 100 British soldiers prisoner. And they go to charge the next barricade. And at that point, Captain Morgan goes through a door and finds that there are no British soldiers on the other side. But the other captains say, no, we're supposed to wait for Montgomery to meet us here. And so they sort of debate back and forth. And by this time, the British have realized the Montgomery is dead. The attacks on the Western walls are fakes, and all they've got to deal with is Arnold's men. And so this is what you're seeing in this picture is the British have now shown up and are fighting the Americans at this point. And by now, also, the British have come behind the Americans. And so the Americans are trapped and and they basically fight until they have no ammunition. And basically, only about one musket in 10 would fire because this wet snow would get into the gunpowder. And the Americans lost. You Yankees lost. I'm Yankee. We lost. But we never end the story here. What am I doing for time?
You're doing fine.
Okay. People my age hate it when I say this, but revolutionaries like Ho Chi Minh would say this was not a failure. The Americans had hundreds of soldiers captured and 50 or more killed, but there were still some Americans surrounding Quebec, and they maintained a siege or a blockade of Quebec. And what shocked Arnold is that the British didn't come out from the city once all this had failed. He figured the British would come out and wipe them out. But the British, remembering the French 13 years earlier, who had failed by coming out of the city, the British stayed in the city. And what's happening is the Americans are racing to get soldiers to Quebec City, sending them up Lake Champlain and what have you. They're racing to get them from Massachusetts and New York. And the British are hoping the ice will go out of the St. Lawrence. And so the British can sail in the St. Lawrence with British soldiers. Well, the British soldiers win that race. They managed to get 10,000 soldiers into Quebec City in early May, while the Americans had only managed to get about 3,000 soldiers to Quebec City, and a third of them had smallpox at that point. But what happened is the Americans just didn't flee. They retreated rather quickly, but they retreated and stopped and fought the British and lost. And they retreated some more and stopped and fought the British and lost. And they retreated to Montreal and stopped and fought the British and lost. And they retreated to the top of Lake Champlain and the same thing. By now it's the fall, it's October, and Arnold manages to cobble together a fleet. And the British have their bigger ships on Lake Champlain, and they come down to attack the Americans and to retake Ticonderoga. Well, they go sailing down Lake Champlain and don't realize the American fleet is all hidden behind Valcour Island. And so there was a big battle where the Americans, they did rather well for, being outgunned, and the Americans again lost. But what happens is they've managed to stop the British for the whole fighting season. You don't fight in the winter. As this battle in Quebec City shows you, it doesn't work that well. You don't fight in the winter when you're using a gun with exposed gunpowder, to the elements. And the British go and say, well, this is crazy. We're not going to go down and take Ticonderoga and have to rebuild it. Let's go back to Montreal, which is right behind us. There's housing, there's food. We can be warm. We'll wait till next year. Well, this gave the Americans the whole year or the whole winter and spring to prepare for the British to continue down Lake Champlain. The British were hoping to split the colonies in half, split New England off from the middle and southern colonies. Well, the Americans got ready and they prepared Fort Ticonderoga, and the British got down and they had two battles that are called the battles at Saratoga, and the Americans won the battles at Saratoga. The Americans actually had a British army of over 6,000 men surrender to them. The British armies did not do this very often, but the Americans had gone and captured 6,000 British soldiers. And what happens towards the end of this battle, if you remember, I said Arnold got shot badly in the leg at Quebec. Well, by now, Arnold had irritated the generals at Saratoga, and they told him to just stay in his tent. He wasn't to participate. Well, Arnold saw that the soldiers, the Americans, needed to be encouraged, and he raced off on his horse and rode between the Americans and the British, rallying the American soldiers, and again gets shot badly in the leg. Ooh, I'm sorry. Uh, and But he manages to turn the tide, and the Americans take the British Army. Now you can't tell the story of the Battle of Saratoga without including Arnold, but nobody wants to put a statue of Arnold up. And so there's a statue of a boot. It does not have his name on it. And the story from back then is that Arnold at one time asked an American what would happen if the Americans captured him after he turned sides. And the person said, well, we'll bury your leg with full military honors, but we'll hang the rest of you. But so the whole story of getting to Quebec was absolutely amazing. And just because they did not take the city does not mean that in many ways after all, we won the revolution. Taking the British at Saratoga made the French out in the open um, supported the Americans. They might have been supporting them quietly, but at that point, the French came out on our side because of the victory at Saratoga. I think I might have come to the end, and I do realize. One of the things about these soldiers who did the Kennebec expedition, the Arnold expedition, they weren't supermen. The laws of hypothermia, the laws of smallpox and dysentery, those haven't changed. I mean, these were not supermen. These were, people who, when they were called upon to be supermen, they did it. They went on and they went through the woods. We're starving, we're getting sick, we're cold, we're freezing, we're attacking this city that was 30-foot tall walls. They were committed enough to the cause that they did it. And there are quite a number of them buried along the Kennebec, because not only are the soldiers who are already here along the Kennebec, but a lot of soldiers on the expedition saw how nice the land was here and came here after the revolution. This is he's now, I think, lieutenant. It was Sergeant Abner Wade from Woolwich, and he's buried in one of our cemeteries. There's actually two other soldiers from the Arnold expedition. And here is his house just down the street from me, which is still standing. And now I think I've reached the end. And this part of the Arnold expedition is we're maintaining not only somewhat, we're doing the museum at the Reuben Colburn House, but we're trying to preserve the trail, including the 13-mile portage. And the five things, I'll try to get these quickly. The five things that I asked you to get to me if I didn't handle was I did deal with the route not being known. No, the route was known, and the idea of sending an army up it had been debated for 100 years. The quality of the boats, Arnold and Washington weren't stupid. They weren't going to send 1,100 soldiers to the Kennebec River, based on some hick going and saying, "Oh yeah, I can get you the boats." Um, it was, obviously Reuben Colburn could get them the boats. And in fact, he's not asked to build 200, he's asked to buy and build 200. And I figure that, he just went up and down the Kennebec River and said to people, "Hey, I'll buy your Ford Pinto and build you a new one over the winter." And so that's why the quality of some of them were probably rather beat up. They also, while building them, I'm sure some of them were built, once the sun had set and the guys were really tired. And so there was some problems with quality. Um, but I don't think the quality of the boats was as major a problem as we make out. I think the major problem were the skills it takes to handle a bateau up rapids. And it just imagine poling 2,000 pounds up rapids. Now going up rapids, you're not going to do that much damage to it. But as soon as it gets away from you, now it's going to go down through the rapids, beating itself up on all the rocks. The other thing is you have a bunch of young men, and I can see you get these young men and they come up and the boat grounds out and they just, young farm boys, they yank on it and haul on it and drag it across the rocks and sand and wear the bottoms out that way. Another thing I said about handling cargo, you could get fined. There were laws against letting your cargo get wet. And so this was something that people already knew to deal with about what you had to do when somebody was paying you to carry a cargo in a bateau. And oh boy, if you want, I could talk forever about that. And the last one is about women and Native Americans and blacks on the trip. Um, we go and we say there were two women on the trip, and right off the bat, I'm going to say there were three. And the reason I say there were three is there's a story about a wife staying with her husband while he starves to death up on the Canadian border. And two different soldiers write about it. But if you read the journals, it's not the same couple. One of them, the dates are wrong. There's a couple of days between each of these events, and one of them, the woman, uh, in 20 hours after her husband died, in 20 hours she's back with her company. The other woman is 3 weeks before she gets back to the American Army. Now, the other story is about this woman who's, breaking through the ice and is forced to raise her skirt and everything up rather high. And the 16-year-old who's writing the journal says nobody would dare make a comment on that. Well, now all three of these things happened 6 weeks into the um, expedition. I would think that if having women on the expedition was unusual, that would have been mentioned at the beginning of the expedition. They actually, at this time period, in a normal uh, campaign, um, 20, if you had 100 soldiers, you would have 25 women and children behind you. They were not left behind to be basically widows and orphans, dependent on whatever town or country they'd come from. It's the same thing with the Indians, is there's almost no mention of them, except for Arnold is constantly writing letters and sending them back to Boston or sending them over to Lake Champlain. Well, I don't think you're taking a farm boy from Woolwich and sending him through the woods to deliver a letter. It's much more likely that he's sending a Native American to do this. And then the other thing about the black soldiers is there is a story from Skowhegan about a wrestling match involving a black soldier. And I guess my point is, if it's normal, you don't mention it. Most of the journals, they don't mention the names of the other five guys in their mess. Uh, it's sort of like you only mention the women, the black soldier wrestling, because it's an unusual event. It's something more than, yeah, we drag the boats and there you are. So um, that's my theory, and I'm glad to discuss that with anybody too. And I guess that's it.
Thank you, Rob, very much. Everyone's clapping. All right, before we go to questions, I have to tell you, I am so excited because you mentioned my fourth great grandfather, Abner Wade. And I'm a direct descendant.
Really?
Yeah, and I didn't know his house was in
Really?
Woolwich. I've been to his grave, but I didn't know his house was there.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it's
just out
down.
of personal. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
you go
my
down.
mom and dad are here too, so I'm telling you right now that was that was our grandfather.
That's yeah. It's if you go down Montsuic Road and then it becomes Phipps Point. It's just down past the something corner, Murphy Corner Cemetery.
Oh, well, I'll
Um,
have to go
yeah,
tomorrow and check it out.
yep, yep.
Thank you. I do have a couple questions for you in the chat. The first one is from Mary Ellen, who asks, were the American soldiers on the Quebec trip mostly New Englanders from Connecticut, Massachusetts, or New York, etc., or from Maine?
They were definitely the majority of the musket men, and there were 10 companies of them, so about 800 or more. They were from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, not a lot from New York or the other nearby colonies. Vermont wasn't a colony. Vermont was claimed by both New Hampshire and New York at that time. And you also have to remember, if they were from Maine, they would have been credited with being from Massachusetts. And so there were probably at least 100 from what is now Maine, and a number from New Hampshire, just over the border from Maine. And then the riflemen, I didn't get into that, but there were three companies of riflemen. They had come from Pennsylvania and Virginia. And as a matter of fact, one of the reasons they got sent on the trip is they were troublemakers. And so, since they sat at the siege of Boston, just sitting there staring at the British, Arnold and Washington wanted to get rid of these riflemen and get them out of there from all their troublemaking they were doing. But the 800 musketmen from New England, 300 riflemen from Pennsylvania and Virginia.
Okay, interesting. The next question is about those bateaus, and I think you started, or you did cover this, but it gets murky after a bit. But how many bateaus were there? And then you talked about the heavy load in them. So the question is, what made up those 2,000 pounds? And then that was spread over how many bateaus?
Well, it was the original request was 200 bateaus, and they did supply 200 bateaus, but Arnold asked them to, immediately build another 20, and those were finished, before even the fourth group left Fort Western. The weight is we have very few sources of information on the cargo, but we have one, and it says that there were 4 barrels and a tent. And when something is called a barrel, you're talking a very specific size. It's like somewhere between 28 and 32 gallons. Every other size barrel had a different name. The little ones were firkins, kegs. Big ones were puncheons and butts and what have you. So 4 barrels is a size that we can figure out, and they had say 200 pounds of salt pork. Now, 200 pounds of salt pork and 20-30 pounds of liquid. I'm not thinking of the word. All the salt and water to preserve the
Mhm,
salt pork, and
mhm.
then the barrel itself weighing
Brine,
about
maybe.
7 brine, thank you,
Mhm, mhm,
weighing about 70 pounds. So you had close to 300 pounds in the barrels.
mhm.
So a bateau that just had, uh, 4 barrels had 1,200 pounds there. You figure the bateau is 400 pounds. The 2 soldiers in it are gonna be 160 pounds each. And, you're at you say 5, 6, 7 soldiers to a bateau. Their personal gear, probably weighed about 55 pounds, per soldier, and I'm sure the majority of their personal gear stayed in the bateau. What they did with the bateau is they took turns. 2 guys would do it one day, another 2 guys in the same mess would do it the next day. One of the interesting things is one journal says the guy named his boat the Charming Lydia,
Aw.
and I'm sitting there thinking, "What are you talking about?" But I've since found out that, um, they did mark their boats, not necessarily, all the soldiers, French and Indian War, and you figure if you take 100 bateaus, all of a sudden you're assigned to a bateau, and your bateau's a good one.
That's
You
yours, yeah.
wanna make sure you get it tomorrow,
Yeah.
and so you put a name to it, or if you wanna make sure you don't get yours, you put a name to it. So the bateaus were personalized,
Hmm,
by the soldiers.
that's interesting. How about this next question that's popped up where, could you speak to whether there were any deserters? And, if so, talk about that and whether there were consequences for those deserters.
There were a number of deserters, even before leaving Fort Western, there were a couple of deserters. Um, there were quite a number of people who turned back sick, and I imagine some of them weren't really sick. Hell, you could call that last group of 275 deserters, but I'm not going to say they were. And when they got to Quebec, there seemed to be a constant flow of deserters on both sides.
Mhm.
British soldiers would desert the city, and American soldiers would desert from the army. As a matter of fact, they were actually planning on attacking the city on the 27th of December, but an American deserter had left and gone over to the British and told them what the plans were. So that's why they had to change the date. But there were a number of deserters. The other thing is I told you about how the officers, somebody referred to the American Revolution as the resignation revolution, and meaning the officers would get teed off about something, and so they'd quit. And the soldiers, the common soldiers, didn't have that option. So a lot of the common soldiers would sit there and say, "I'm tired, I'm cold, I need to go home and plant my crops." So there was quite enough, and there's quite a number of records of them coming back, 4 weeks later. But it was a problem, it was an issue.
Okay, I think we've got time for two more questions. First one is you spoke a bit about how Benedict Arnold was unliked by his, I think you said by his peers or the higher ups, but liked very much by his
Yeah.
men. Could you talk a little bit about that? You know, how do you know that, and um, what do you
Well,
think about that?
he Arnold say when he marched off with his militia at the very beginning to Cambridge to the Seas of Boston. As soon as he got there, he found housing. They found some mansion that a Tory had abandoned, and he got housing for his men. Um, Going the other way towards getting ready to attack Quebec, a couple of the captains refused, and but their men said, "No, no, we're sticking with Arnold. We're going to attack." And actually, the captains ended up going with their men. But no, I guess there are plenty of examples of where he makes sure his men get fed, make sure his men get clothing, and he also, I guess, was very active. He didn't, if he said go carry this from here to there, he would be carrying something also. Um, I think all the officers were like that in that they put their backs to it too. They didn't just expect their soldiers to do it. And then with his peers, thank you for giving me the correct word. This is what the general, so not his peer, the general over him on the Northern Army uh, during the summer of '76. The general's constantly writing, to Washington or the Congress saying that his officers are worthless except for Arnold, that Arnold is the one good officer. But then by Saratoga, Arnold had even managed to irritate that general. And he was the one who told Arnold he wasn't to be involved and didn't give him any credit for having turned the tide on the battle.
Hmm, thank you. All right, another question here actually kind of goes, let's make this our last question because there are a few questions that are sort of connected. But is it true that Arnold stopped at Pownall to study the route, and then other questions ask where did they stop along the way in our area?
Um, there's actually a house down near Popham that the family myth, true or not, is that he stopped there and had a meal.
Mhm.
I think there are a couple of houses in Dave's Ferry in Woolwich that believe that some of the soldiers stayed there. Um, the he definitely stayed at the Reuben Colburn house. Um, it's known that some soldiers stayed at Swan Island or in Gardner at that point. Um, going up. It's interesting. There's a spot 5 miles below Fort Halifax that a number of people stopped at, and the name of I think that spot was owned by Remington Hobby, and Remington Hobby was one of the people who helped plan the route. Stopping at the Pownell Courthouse is again this whole thing that Arnold didn't have a map or that the journal he had was badly done. Um, the guy Samuel Goodwin.
Mhm.
He was the number one man on the Kennebec since the 1750s, and he obviously would have had a copy of the map because nobody the people in Kennebec and the people in Boston weren't enemies with each other. And he even writes a letter to George Washington saying he's asking to get paid for the maps that he had reproduced and the journals that he had reproduced for the Arnold expedition. Um, they definitely stopped at Skowhegan. Um, they do comment on the site of the Norjawak Indians and Father Rails gravestone. Um, those are all that are, I mean, but I mean, you figure every 7 to 10 miles, they're stopping
Right.
somewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I know I have more questions, but I think that we're nearing the end of our availability for time. So let's end it there. Thank you very much, Rob. This was really interesting. And I really appreciate you taking time to be with us tonight, and to share this. And everyone who's here, thank you for participating. I will have a recording of this available to watch next week. And we also have another talk, same time, same place next week. This one is about the restoration of the Kavanaugh House in Damerscott Mills. So we're turning to a totally different subject. But again, thank you, Rob. Thank you all. Really,
Oh, my
really
pleasure.
enjoyed this. Thank you. All right. Good night.
Good night.